The boots came at dawn. Elena Brighton stood at her bedroom window curtain pulled back just enough to see them. Over 200 Navy SEALs in formation on her front lawn, their shadows stretching across the quiet suburban street like a declaration of war. At the center stood the disabled veteran she'd shared breakfast with 27 hours earlier, crutch wedged under his arm, missing his left leg below the knee, eyes locked on her front door with the intensity of someone who'd come to settle a debt. Two military police vehicles idled at the corner, their engines rumbling like a promise of consequences yet to come. A news helicopter circled overhead, camera trained on the scene below. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd only offered him a seat at a diner table. One act of basic human decency in a world that had turned its back on him. How had it escalated to this? Her phone vibrated on the nightstand. 17 missed calls. 43 text messages. The news alerts kept coming, each one more surreal than the last. She let the curtain fall and closed her eyes. 27 hours earlier, none of this had existed. 27 hours earlier, Elena Brighton had been elbow deep in someone else's catastrophe. The trauma bay at Riverside General Hospital smelled like disinfectant and desperation, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as she worked to stabilize a 52-year-old man who'd wrapped his pickup truck around a telephone pole. His chest was a roadmap of bruises, his breathing shallow and wet. Pneumothorax, she'd called it, before the attending even looked at the x-ray. Chest tube now. The resident beside her fumbled with the sterile packaging, hands shaking. Elena didn't wait for permission. She prepped the site herself, made the incision, and guided the tube between his ribs with the steady confidence of someone who knew exactly how many seconds they had before the man's lung collapsed completely. 16 seconds. She'd done it in 12. By the time Dr. Marcus Waverly arrived, the patient's oxygen saturation was climbing back towards safe territory. The attending glanced at the monitor and grunted. "Next time, wait for me before you make executive decisions, Brighton." Elena peeled off her gloves, her scrubs splattered with blood that wasn't hers. "Next time, show up before your patient dies." The resident's eyes went wide. Waverly's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He never did. Elena had been at Riverside General for 6 years, longer than most of the residents and half the attendings. She knew which protocols could bend and which ones would break you. More importantly, she knew how to save lives when the people with fancy degrees were still trying to remember which textbook chapter applied. Her shift had started at 4 in the afternoon the previous day. It was now 8 in the morning. 16 hours of back-to-back emergencies, understaffed chaos, and administrative incompetence masquerading as hospital policy. Her lower back ached and her feet screamed inside her sneakers, and she'd consumed enough coffee to fuel a small aircraft. She clocked out, grabbed her jacket from her locker, and walked out into the cool morning air of Denver, a city that prided itself on being authentically Western while gentrifying faster than anyone wanted to admit. The Anchor Diner sat 3 blocks from the hospital, a relic from the 1960s, with cracked vinyl booths and a neon sign that flickered like it was sending Morse code. Elena had been going there since her first week at Riverside General. The coffee was terrible, but it was consistently terrible, which counted for something. She pushed through the door at 8:17, the little bell above the frame announcing her arrival. The place was half full. Early risers, truckers, hospital staff from the night shift, looking as hollowed out as she felt. She slid into her usual booth by the window, the one with the duct-taped cushion and a view of the parking lot. "Usual?" asked Marianne, the waitress, who'd worked there longer than Elena had been alive. "Double usual," Elena said, "and keep the coffee coming." Marianne smirked. "Rough night." "Aren't they all?" She just pulled out her phone to mindlessly scroll through nothing when the door opened again. The man who walked in moved carefully, deliberately, his weight supported by a crutch tucked under his right arm. His left pant leg hung empty below the knee, pinned neatly against his thigh. He wore a faded navy t-shirt, cargo pants, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Chief Warrant Officer Kane Morrison. Elena didn't know his name yet. She only saw what everyone else saw, a disabled veteran trying to find a place to sit. He approached the first booth. 2 men in business suits, laptops open, barely looked up. "Excuse me," Kane said quietly. "Is this seat taken?" "We're expecting someone," one of them replied without making eye contact. They weren't. Their briefcases sat on the empty seats. Kane nodded and moved on. The next table had a woman and her teenage daughter. He didn't even get the question out before the woman shook her head. "We're about to leave." They weren't. Their food had just arrived. Kane's jaw tightened, but he kept moving. Booth after booth, table after table, the same answer delivered in different variations of discomfort and dismissal. "No room. Waiting for a friend. Maybe try the counter." The counter was full. Elena watched it happen with a sinking sensation in her chest that felt too familiar, too much like the memory of her father coming home from the Gulf with a limp and a look in his eyes that said he'd left the best parts of himself in the sand. Staff Sergeant Daniel Brighton had been a Marine, a man who'd carried wounded men on his back and earned a Purple Heart for his trouble. He'd also been a man the VA failed, a man whose PTSD went untreated until it became unmanageable. A man who died alone in a motel room 6 years after coming home because the country he'd served didn't have the decency to offer him a chair when he needed one. Kane approached her booth last. He stood there for a moment, crutch planted firmly, shoulders squared, despite the exhaustion written across his face. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and careful, like he was bracing for another rejection. "Would it be all right if I sat here?" Elena didn't hesitate. "Please," she said. "I'd actually appreciate the company." Relief flickered across his face, subtle but real. He lowered himself into the seat across from her, propping his crutch against the wall. Up close, she could see the faint scars on his forearms, the kind that came from shrapnel or debris, the too familiar weariness of someone who'd learned to carry weight no one else could see. "Thank you," he said. "Don't mention it." Marianne appeared with coffee for Elena and a menu for Kane. He ordered scrambled eggs, toast, and black coffee. Simple, efficient. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that wasn't awkward so much as mutually understood. Elena stirred sugar into her coffee. Kane watched the parking lot through the window. "Long shift?" he asked eventually. 16 hours, Elena said. "Trauma unit." He nodded like he understood more than she'd said. "You just passing through?" Elena asked. "Had some VA appointments in Denver," Kane said. "Figured I'd stop for breakfast before heading back." "Back where?" "Virginia, little place outside Norfolk." "A SEAL then, or former SEAL?" Elena's father had taught her to recognize the quiet intensity, the controlled posture, the way operators moved through the world like they were still on mission even when they weren't. Kane's food arrived. He ate methodically, no wasted motion. Elena found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't, all shift the weight of the last 16 hours starting to lift. "Can I ask you something?" Kane said, setting down his fork. "Sure." "Why'd you let me sit here?" Elena met his eyes. "Why wouldn't I?" Everyone else seemed to have a reason. She thought about her father, about the way people had looked at him when he came back like he was broken glass they didn't want to touch. About the quiet erosion of dignity that happened when the world decided you were inconvenient. "My dad was a Marine," she said simply. "I know what it looks like when people forget." Kane went very still. Then he nodded just once, the kind of nod that carried the weight of shared understanding. They talked for another 20 minutes. Not about combat, not the Hollywood version, but the aftermath, the adjusting, the strange loneliness of coming home to a country that thanked you for your service and then looked away. About her father who taught her to shoot and tie knots and recognize the difference between someone who was hurting and someone who was dangerous. About the small kindnesses that mattered more than grand gestures. When Kane reached for the check, Elena was faster. She handed Marianne her card before he could argue. "You don't have to," Kane said. "I know," Elena said. "I want to." His throat worked. "Thank you." "Thank you for your service," she said, and meant it in a way that went deeper than the usual platitude. They walked out together, Elena heading toward her car, Kane toward a pickup truck with Virginia plates. She was unlocking her door when the diner's front door banged open. Robert Delacroix, the owner, a thick-necked man in his 50s with a permanent scowl and a receding hairline, stood on the threshold glaring after them. "You know," he called out loud enough to carry across the parking lot, "you really shouldn't encourage that kind of scene in my establishment." Elena turned slowly. "Excuse me." "People come here for a quiet breakfast," Robert said, his eyes flicking toward Kane with barely concealed disdain. "Not to deal with complications. Bad for business." Kane's hand tightened on his crutch, but he said nothing. Elena felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. "That complication," she said, her voice dangerously calm, "is a decorated Navy SEAL. He served this country. He saved lives, and you couldn't spare him a seat." Robert's face reddened. "I run a business, not a charity." "Then you're running it wrong." She got in her car and drove away before she said something she'd regret, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. Kane's truck pulled out behind her, heading in the opposite direction. She thought that was the end of it. 10 minutes later, while she was stopped at a red light, her phone buzzed. A text from her supervisor, Margaret Holland. "Need you to come in for a meeting, 2 p.m. today. Non-negotiable." Elena stared at the message. She'd just worked a 16-hour shift. She was supposed to have the next 2 days off. "What's this about?" she typed back. The reply came fast. "Complaint filed. We'll discuss in person." The light turned green. Elena drove home on autopilot, her mind racing. A complaint about what she'd saved a man's life in the trauma bay. She'd followed protocol. She'd the diner. Robert Delacroix. She parked in her driveway, sat in the car for 5 full minutes, and then forced herself to go inside. Her apartment was small, tidy decorated with photographs of her father in uniform and national park posters she'd collected over the years. She showered, changed into clean clothes, and tried to sleep. She couldn't. At 1:45, she walked back into Riverside General Hospital, this time through the administrative entrance. Margaret Holland was waiting in her office, a sharp-featured woman in her early 50s, with reading glasses on a chain and the permanent expression of someone managing a crisis. "Sit," Margaret said. Elena sat. Margaret slid a folder across the desk. "We received a complaint this morning from Robert Delacroix, owner of the Anchor Diner. He alleges that you engaged in politically inflammatory behavior while wearing hospital-affiliated attire, specifically by making a scene regarding military service and implying discrimination." Elena's jaw dropped. "I was off the clock. I wasn't even wearing scrubs. I had my jacket on." "You were seen leaving the hospital in scrubs earlier this morning. The connection was made." "Connection to what I bought breakfast for a veteran. That's it." Margaret sighed. "It's more complicated than that. Robert Delacroix's brother, Vincent Delacroix, sits on the hospital's board of directors. He's pushing for disciplinary action. Suspension pending a formal review." The words hit like a physical blow. "You're kidding." "I'm not. This is insane. I didn't do anything wrong." "You made a board member's family look bad in public," Margaret said quietly. "Right or wrong doesn't always matter when politics are involved." Elena stood her chair, scraping loudly against the floor. "So I'm being punished for basic human decency. You're being placed on temporary suspension while we investigate the complaint. It's standard procedure." Elena stopped herself. Margaret didn't disagree. She could see it in the older woman's eyes. "I'm sorry, Elena, I really am, but my hands are tied." Elena walked out of the office, her vision tunneling, her pulse roaring in her ears. She made it halfway to the parking lot before her pager went off. Mass casualty incident, multiple vehicles, all hands on deck. She stopped, stared at the pager. She was suspended. She wasn't supposed to be here. But people were dying. Elena turned around and ran back inside. The emergency department was already chaos. Gurneys lined the hallways, paramedics shouting updates, residents scrambling to triage. Dr. Waverly was barking orders, his face flushed. "Brighton!" He spotted her instantly. "I don't care what your status is. Scrub in now." She didn't argue. She grabbed a trauma gown, snapped on gloves, and moved into the fray. The first patient was a teenager, unconscious, skull fracture, pupils unequal. The second was a woman in her 30s, internal bleeding pressure dropping fast. And then they brought in Kane Morrison. Elena's stomach dropped. He was on a gurney, his face covered in soot and blood, his breathing labored. The paramedic rattled off his condition, barely pausing for breath. White male, early 30s, pulled 3 civilians from a burning vehicle before the gas tank blew. Smoke inhalation, second-degree burns on his arms, and back, possible broken ribs. He refused transport until everyone else was clear. Of course he did. Elena took the head of the gurney, her hands steady even as her mind screamed. "Kane, Kane, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open. Recognition flickered. "The nurse." "Yeah, the nurse. You're going to be fine, but I need you to stay with me." "Civilians first." "They're fine. You got them out. Now let me get you stable." She worked fast. Airway assessment, oxygen mask, B8 pain management. His vitals stabilized, but the burns needed treatment and his lungs needed monitoring. She moved him toward a treatment room just as the main doors burst open again. But this time it wasn't paramedics. It was a SEAL team. 6 operators in full tactical gear, moving with the precision of men who'd done this 1,000 times, scanning the room like they were clearing a hostile building. The lead operator, tall, broad-shouldered, with a close-cropped beard and eyes like flint, approached the nurse's station. "Where's Chief Warrant Officer Kane Morrison?" he demanded. A nurse pointed toward Elena's treatment room. The operator's gaze swung to Elena, then to Kane on the gurney. He stepped inside his team, fanning out behind him. "Chief," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You good?" Kane managed a weak grin. "Been better, Commander." The commander turned to Elena. "You treating him?" "Yes." "Then you just became the most important person in this building." Elena blinked. "I what?" The commander pulled out his phone, made a call, and spoke in clipped, efficient sentences. "Morrison is stable. Civilian nurse has him. We need the hospital director now." He hung up and looked at Elena. "Name?" "Elena Brighton." "Lieutenant Commander Garrett Sullivan," he said. "Chief Morrison pulled 3 civilians from a burning wreck. He's a hero, And if anyone in this hospital tries to tell me otherwise, we're going to have a serious problem. Elena's pulse thundered. I don't think... Who suspended you? Sullivan asked. She froze. How did you... Morrison told us. Called it in before the accident. Said some bastard at a diner tried to humiliate him. Said a nurse stood up for him. Said the hospital was retaliating. Elena's breath caught. Sullivan stepped closer, his voice dropping. You saved his life both times. Once with kindness, once with skill. That doesn't go unanswered. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. The hospital director, Dr. Daniel Westbrook, a man in his 60s with perfectly styled gray hair and a suit that cost more than Elena's monthly rent, appeared flanked by Vincent Delacroix. Commander Sullivan, Westbrook said smoothly. I understand there's been some concern. Save it, Sullivan said. I want to know why one of your nurses is being punished for showing basic human decency to a decorated veteran. Westbrook's smile faltered. Vincent Delacroix stepped forward. This is a personnel matter that doesn't... It absolutely concerns me, Sullivan interrupted. Chief Morrison is a member of my unit. Any retaliation against someone who treated him with respect is a federal issue, especially when your hospital receives veteran care grants. Want me to make a call to the oversight committee? Vincent went pale. Sullivan pulled out his phone again. Or we can do this the easy way. Reinstate Nurse Brighton, apologize, and we walk away. The hallway went silent. Westbrook cleared his throat. I'm sure we can resolve this amicably. You've got 24 hours, Sullivan said. Clock's ticking. He turned to Elena, his expression softening just slightly. You good here? She nodded, still reeling. Good. Morrison's team is outside. They'll make sure nothing unexpected happens. He walked out, his team following in perfect formation. The director and Vincent Delacroix exchanged a look that could have curdled milk. Elena turned back to Kane, who was watching her with something like awe. You didn't have to do this, she said quietly. Yeah, Kane said. I did. Outside in the parking lot, the rest of Kane's SEAL team stood in formation. 30 operators armed, alert, and waiting. And behind them, rolling up in unmarked vehicles, were reporters. Someone had made a call, and now the whole city was about to find out exactly what had happened at the Anchor Diner. The first camera crew arrived within 12 minutes. Elena watched through the treatment room window as a local news van pulled into the emergency bay, its satellite dish extending like an antenna searching for signal. The reporter, a young woman in a blazer, despite the heat, was already talking into her microphone, gesturing toward the line of SEALs standing at parade rest near the ambulance entrance. This can't be happening, Elena muttered. Kane shifted on the gurney, wincing, as the movement pulled at his burns. Too late to put the genie back in the bottle. I didn't ask for this. Neither did I. His voice was steady despite the pain medication starting to fog his edges. But here we are. Dr. Waverly appeared in the doorway, his expression caught somewhere between alarm and fascination. Brighton, we need to move him to a monitored bed. His oxygen saturation is holding, but those burns need proper dressing and observation. Elena nodded, already releasing the gurney's brake. They moved Kane through the corridor, past gawking residents and nurses who'd heard the commotion but hadn't yet pieced together the full story. The unit clerk's phone rang nonstop. Media requests, administrative calls, messages from people who'd somehow already heard fragments of what was unfolding. They settled Kane into a private room on the medical floor, away from the chaos of the ER. Elena started a saline drip, checked his vitals again, and began the careful process of cleaning and dressing his burns. The skin across his forearms was angry and red, blistered in places where the heat had been most intense. You ran into a burning car, she said quietly. 3 people were trapped. You could have died. So could they. Kane met her eyes. Would you have walked away? Elena thought about the 16-hour shift she'd just worked, the pneumothorax patient she'd tubed without waiting for the attending, the countless times she'd put herself between chaos and catastrophe because someone had to. No, she said. Then you know why I didn't. She finished wrapping his left arm in sterile gauze, her movements precise and gentle. The commander said you called this in before the accident, that you told them about the diner. Kane looked away, suddenly uncomfortable. Standard protocol. We check in with our team when we're traveling. I mentioned what happened. Sullivan asked if I wanted him to handle it. I said no. He paused. Then the crash happened, and I didn't have time to tell him to stand down. So this wasn't planned. The crash wasn't, but Sullivan... Kane's mouth quirked into something that wasn't quite a smile. He doesn't do anything halfway. Once I ended up in this hospital, once he heard you were suspended, there was no stopping him. Elena taped down the final edge of gauze and stepped back. Your commander threatened a federal investigation. He wasn't bluffing. Kane's eyes were getting heavier, the pain medication pulling him towards sleep. The hospital gets veteran care grants, federal funding, state partnerships, VA contracts. If they're retaliating against staff for treating veterans with dignity, that's a violation of the grant terms. Sullivan knows how to use leverage. Elena sank into the chair beside his bed, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was ebbing. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Probably. Kane's eyes were already closing. But you didn't start this fight, Elena. They did. She sat there until his breathing evened out, until the monitors settled into their steady rhythm, until the weight of what was happening finally crashed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. When she stepped out into the hallway, Lieutenant Commander Sullivan was waiting. "How is he?" Sullivan asked. "Stable. Burns are second-degree painful, but manageable. His lungs are clear despite the smoke inhalation. He'll need observation for the next 24 hours, but he should make a full recovery." Sullivan nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Good. That's good." "You didn't have to do this," Elena said. "Yeah, I did." Sullivan crossed his arms. "Chief Morrison has one of the most distinguished service records I've seen. Lost his leg pulling wounded civilians from a collapsed building in Kandahar. 11 lives saved that day. Bronze Star medical retirement he fought against for a year." His jaw tightened. "He comes home, tries to get breakfast at a diner, and gets treated like he's invisible, like he's an inconvenience. That doesn't fly with me. And me? You're the only person in that diner who saw him as human. The only one who made space." Sullivan's eyes were hard. "Then your hospital tries to punish you for it because some small-minded businessman got his ego bruised. You think I'm going to let that slide?" Elena swallowed hard. "The director said he'd resolve it. Westbrook is a bureaucrat. He'll say whatever keeps the peace until he can figure out how to make this go away quietly." Sullivan pulled out his phone, showed her the screen. It was a news article already posted online. Navy SEAL hero discriminated at local diner. Suspended nurse saves his life hours later. The photo showed Kane being wheeled into the hospital, Elena visible in the background, her face set in concentration. Below it, a second photo showed the SEALs standing in formation outside the emergency entrance. "This isn't going away quietly," Sullivan said. "It's already trending on social media. Veterans groups are picking it up. By tonight, this will be national." Elena's stomach dropped. "I don't want to be famous." "Too bad. You're the face of this story now." Sullivan pocketed his phone. "But you're not alone. My team stays until this is resolved. Anyone gives you trouble, you call me directly." He handed her a card with his number. "I mean it. Anyone." He walked away, his boots echoing down the corridor with the same measured cadence as his operators outside. Elena stared at the card in her hand. 24 hours ago, she'd been an ICU nurse with a suspended license and a quiet life. Now she was at the center of a media storm involving military special operations, hospital politics, and the kind of attention that made her skin crawl. Her phone buzzed. A text from her friend and fellow nurse, Rachel Kim. "Holy shit, you're on the news. Are you okay?" Then another from a number she didn't recognize. "You're a hero. Thank you for standing up for our veterans." And another. "Stuck up, bitch. You just wanted attention. Hope you lose your job." Elena turned off her phone. By 6 in the evening, the hospital's parking lot looked like a media circus. 7 news vans, reporters conducting interviews with anyone who'd talk, camera crews filming background footage of the building's exterior. Hospital security had set up barricades to keep them away from the entrances, but they couldn't stop the coverage. Elena stayed in Kane's room, monitoring his condition, adjusting his medication, avoiding the windows. Dr. Waverly stopped by twice, said nothing about the suspension, and left again without meeting her eyes. Margaret Holland sent a terse email. "Board meeting tomorrow 9 a.m. Your presence is required." No apology, no acknowledgement of what had happened, just a summons. Elena was checking Kane's IV when the door opened and a woman in an expensive pantsuit walked in. She was in her 40s, blonde, with the kind of polished confidence that came from years of controlling narratives. "Miss Brighton, I'm Caroline Fletcher, Hospital Public Relations." She extended a hand that Elena didn't shake. "We need to talk about how you're going to handle media requests." "I'm not," Caroline blinked. "Excuse me. I'm not handling media requests. I'm not giving interviews. I'm not making statements." Elena kept her voice level. "I'm a nurse doing my job, that's all. With respect, this situation has escalated beyond your personal preferences. The hospital's reputation is at stake." "The hospital's reputation?" Elena turned to face her fully. "Your director suspended me for buying a veteran breakfast. Your board member's brother filed a bogus complaint because I called out his discrimination. And now you want me to help you spin this? Caroline's smile tightened. We want to present a unified front, show that Riverside General supports both our staff and our veteran patients. Then reinstate me publicly and issue an apology to Chief Morrison for what happened at that diner. That's complicated. No, it's simple. You're just more worried about protecting Vincent Delacroix than doing the right thing. Caroline's professional mask slipped, revealing something colder underneath. Be very careful, Miss Brighton. You may have social media on your side right now, but public opinion is fickle. The hospital has lawyers, resources, connections. If you push too hard, you might find yourself not just suspended, but unemployable. Elena stepped closer, her voice dropping to something quiet and dangerous. Is that a threat? It's a reality check. Then here's mine. I'm not scared of your lawyers or your connections or your carefully crafted PR statements. I did nothing wrong. And if you think you can bully me into silence, you're about to learn exactly how wrong you are. Caroline's jaw tightened. She turned and walked out without another word. Elena's hands were shaking again. She sat down, pressed her palms against her thighs, and forced herself to breathe. Behind her, Kane's voice was rough with sleep and medication. You're tougher than you look. She turned. He was watching her, his eyes clearer than they'd been an hour ago. I thought you were asleep. Drifting in and out. Heard enough. He shifted, grimacing. Fletcher's a piece of work. She tried to get me to sign a release form when they first brought me in. Something about not holding the hospital liable for pre-existing conditions. You're kidding. Wish I was. I told her where she could file it. Kane managed a weak grin. Sullivan threatened to have his JAG officer review every form in this place. She left pretty quick after that. Elena felt something loosen in her chest, a laugh that was half exhaustion and half disbelief. This is insane. Yeah, Kane's expression sobered, but it's also important. What happened at that diner that happens to veterans every day? We get thanked for our service, then treated like we're broken or inconvenient or too complicated to deal with. Most of the time, nobody notices. Nobody cares. He paused. You cared, and now people are paying attention. That matters. I just wanted to give you a seat. And that's exactly why this matters. The night shift arrived at 7. Elena should have left hours ago, but her suspension meant she wasn't technically on duty, and nobody seemed willing to tell her to go home. She stayed in Kane's room, updating his chart, monitoring his vitals, being useful in the only way she knew how. At 9:47, her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Hello, Elena Brighton. The voice was male, professional, unfamiliar. Who's asking? My name is Nathaniel Ross. I'm an attorney with the Colorado Veterans Legal Alliance. I saw the news coverage. I'd like to offer you legal representation pro bono. Elena closed her eyes. I'm not suing anyone. Not yet, but the hospital might come after you. Wrongful termination, breach of contract, defamation. They have options if they want to use them. You need someone in your corner. I can't afford. Pro bono means free, Miss Brighton. We represent veterans and those who support them. What you did today falls squarely in our wheelhouse. Ross's tone was matter-of-fact. I'm not asking you to commit to anything. I'm just saying if you need help, we're here. Elena thought about Caroline Fletcher's thinly veiled threats, about Vincent Delacroix's connections, about the way power worked when you didn't have any. Can I think about it? Of course. I'll send you my contact information. If you need me, call. If you don't, no hard feelings. He hung up. Elena stared at her phone, feeling like she was being pulled into a current she couldn't control. At 11:03, a nurse from the ICU poked her head into Kane's room. Brighton, there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent. Elena followed her downstairs, expecting another reporter or PR handler. Instead, she found herself face-to-face with Robert Delacroix. He stood in the lobby, his face flushed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The security guard nearby had one hand on his radio, clearly ready to intervene if necessary. You, Robert spat. You ruined me. Elena stopped 3 feet away, her pulse spiking. I didn't do anything to you. My diner's been flooded with phone calls, protesters outside, people leaving one-star reviews online saying I discriminate against veterans. I've had to close early because someone threw a brick through my window. His voice rose. This is your fault. No, Elena said quietly. This is yours. You refused to seat a disabled veteran. You filed a bogus complaint to get me suspended. You made this mess. He was making people uncomfortable. He was trying to eat breakfast. The only person making anyone uncomfortable was you. Robert took a step forward. The security guard moved instantly, blocking his path. "Sir, you need to calm down. I want her fired. I want her arrested for slander. You need to leave," the guard said firmly. "Now." Robert's mouth worked, fury and desperation warring across his face. "This isn't over." "Yeah," Elena said. "It is." Security escorted him out. Elena watched through the glass doors as he climbed into his car and peeled out of the parking lot, tires squealing. The guard turned to her. "You okay?" "Yeah, thanks." "For what it's worth," he lowered his voice, "most of us staff are on your side. What you did was right." Elena managed a tired smile. "Doesn't always feel like it." "Rarely does. That's how you know it mattered." She went back upstairs, her legs heavy, her mind spinning. Kane was awake again, watching the news on the small TV mounted to the wall. The coverage showed footage of the diner, now surrounded by protesters holding signs. "Veterans deserve respect. Shame on Anchor Diner. Support Nurse Brighton." Kane muted the TV. "It's spreading like wildfire." Elena collapsed into the chair. "Robert Delacroix just showed up. Threatened me. Security kicked him out." Kane's expression hardened. "Sullivan needs to know." "It's fine. He's just angry. Angry people do stupid things." Kane reached for his phone on the bedside table, typed a quick message. "Sullivan will make sure you're covered." Elena wanted to argue, but she was too tired. Instead, she leaned back and closed her eyes, listening to the steady beep of the monitors, the distant sound of the hospital at night. "You should go home," Kane said after a while. "Get some sleep. I'm suspended. I don't have anywhere else to be." "You've been awake for over 30 hours. Elena opened her eyes. "But if I leave, something else will happen, something I won't be able to control. At least here I can be useful." Kane was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When I lost my leg, I spent 6 months in rehab. The Navy offered me a medical discharge. Full pension, go home, rest. I fought them for another year to stay on active duty." His voice was soft. "Took me a long time to learn that my value isn't just what I can do. It's who I am, what I stand for." "And what do you stand for?" "Same thing you do. Showing up, doing the right thing even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Elena felt something crack in her chest, the kind of crack that lets light in. "I'm really glad I let you sit at my table," she said. "Me too." She stayed until he fell asleep again, then finally forced herself to leave. The parking lot was mostly empty, now the media van's gone, except for one overnight crew filming a recap segment. Elena drove home through silent streets, her mind too wired for sleep despite her exhaustion. Her apartment felt strange and unfamiliar, like she'd been gone for weeks instead of hours. She showered, changed into pajamas, and was about to climb into bed when her phone lit up with a notification. An email from Vincent Delacroix. She opened it, her stomach nodding. "Miss Brighton, I understand you believe you acted appropriately in your encounter with my brother and the subsequent events at Riverside General. However, you have caused significant reputational and financial harm to both his business and this hospital's standing in the community. I strongly advise you to consider the consequences of your continued involvement in this matter. A public apology and acknowledgement of wrongdoing would go a long way toward resolving the situation amicably. Failure to cooperate will result in the hospital pursuing all available legal and professional remedies, including permanent termination and potential civil action. Sincerely, Vincent Delacroix, Board Director, Riverside General Hospital." Elena read it twice, then she forwarded it to Nathaniel Ross with a single line. "I think I need that lawyer." His reply came in under 2 minutes. "I'll be at the board meeting tomorrow. Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and don't back down." Elena set her phone aside and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow would determine everything: her career, her reputation, her future. The board would expect her to apologize, to make this go away quietly. But she thought about her father, who'd come home from war and been failed by a system that forgot him. About Kane, who'd lost his leg saving civilians and couldn't get a seat in a diner. About every veteran who'd been thanked for their service and then discarded like yesterday's news. She thought about the look on Robert Delacroix's face when he'd said Kane was making people uncomfortable. And she thought about the way Kane had looked at her in that diner, relieved and grateful, like someone had finally seen him as human. Elena turned off the light. Tomorrow she'd walk into that boardroom. Tomorrow she'd face Vincent Delacroix and Director Westbrook and everyone who wanted her to disappear. Tomorrow she'd stand her ground. But tonight, for just a few hours, she let herself fall into dreamless, exhausted sleep. The alarm went off at 6:30. Elena dressed carefully, professional, but not submissive. A navy blazer over a white blouse, slacks, her hair pulled back. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. The woman staring back looked harder ready. She drove to the hospital early, parking in the employee lot. The morning sun was just starting to burn through the clouds, casting everything in sharp relief. She walked in through the main entrance, nodded to the security guard who'd helped her last night, and took the elevator to the third floor where the administrative offices were located. Nathaniel Ross was waiting outside the boardroom. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-40s, dark hair, sharp suit, and an expression that said he'd seen this kind of fight before. Elena Brighton? That's me. He shook her hand firmly. Nathaniel Ross. Ready. Not even a little. Good. Means you're paying attention. He gestured to the closed boardroom door. They're going to try to intimidate you. They'll use corporate language, veiled threats, maybe even fake sympathy. Don't fall for it. Stick to the facts. Don't apologize for anything. And let me handle the legal angles. What if they fire me? Then we sue. Wrongful termination, retaliation, violation of whistleblower protections. We'll bury them in paperwork. Ross's smile was sharp. But they won't fire you. Not today. Not with the media watching. How can you be sure? Because I sent them a letter at 7 this morning outlining exactly what would happen if they did. Elena stared at him. You what? Preemptive strike works every time. He checked his watch. It's 9 o'clock. Time to go. Elena took a breath, squared her shoulders, and walked into the boardroom. 8 people sat around a mahogany table. Director Westbrook at the head, Vincent Delacroix to his right, Margaret Holland, 2 other board members. Elena didn't recognize Caroline Fletcher, and the hospital's chief legal counsel, a woman named Patricia Warner. All eyes turned to Elena as she entered. Ross followed, closing the door behind them. Westbrook folded his hands on the table. Miss Brighton, Mr. Ross, thank you for joining us. Let's skip the pleasantries, Ross said, sitting down and gesturing for Elena to do the same. We all know why we're here. Vincent Delacroix's face reddened. This is a closed personnel meeting. Your presence is perfectly legal given that your hospital sent my client a threatening email last night suggesting termination and civil action. Ross pulled out a printed copy of Vincent's email. That constitutes potential wrongful termination and retaliation. Miss Brighton has every right to legal representation. Patricia Warner cleared her throat. Mr. Delacroix sent that email in his personal capacity, not as a representative of the hospital, using his hospital email address and his title as board director. Try again. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Westbrook cleared his throat. Perhaps we can start fresh. Miss Brighton, we've reviewed the events of the past 48 hours. The incident at the Anchor Diner, the complaint filed by Robert Delacroix, and the subsequent publicity. We want to understand your perspective. Elena met his eyes. My perspective is simple. I bought breakfast for a veteran who'd been turned away by everyone else in that diner. I was off duty out of uniform acting as a private citizen. Then I was suspended because a board member's brother didn't like being called out for discriminating against a disabled Navy SEAL. Vincent slammed his hand on the table. My brother did not discriminate. He refused to seat Chief Warrant Officer Kane Morrison because of his disability and veteran status. He made it clear that Kane's presence was bad for business. Then he filed a false complaint to retaliate against me for standing up for him. Elena's voice was steady, each word precise. That's textbook discrimination. You have no proof. Actually, Ross interrupted, we have security footage from the diner showing multiple empty tables and several customers turning Chief Morrison away. We also have witness statements from other patrons, and we have Chief Morrison's own testimony along with that of his commanding officer. Vincent's face went from red to purple. Ross continued, your brother's insurance company released the footage as part of their investigation into the brick-throwing incident. Public record now. Funny how these things work out. Westbrook raised a hand. Gentlemen, please, let's stay focused. He turned to Elena. Miss Brighton, regardless of the circumstances, your actions have created a significant public relations challenge for this hospital. We're receiving threats. Protests are planned outside the building. Our donors are asking questions. Then maybe you should have thought about that before suspending me. Margaret Holland spoke for the first time. Elena, nobody's questioning your clinical skills or your dedication, but you have to understand this has become bigger than one incident. The hospital's reputation is built on treating patients with dignity and respect, Elena interrupted, including veterans. If your reputation can't survive me doing the right thing, then maybe your reputation needs to be challenged. Caroline Fletcher leaned forward. We're prepared to offer you a compromise. Full reinstatement, back pay for your suspension, and a public statement supporting your actions. In return, we need you to make a joint appearance with Director Westbrook and Chief Morrison showing unity in putting this matter to rest. Elena glanced at Ross. He gave a barely perceptible shake of his head. What about the complaint? Elena asked. We'll dismiss it with prejudice, Patricia Warner said. It'll be removed from your file entirely. And Vincent Delacroix, Westbrook shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Delacroix will recuse himself from any future personnel decisions involving you. That's not enough. Vincent shot to his feet. How dare you? Sit down, Ross said calmly, or I'll have you removed for disrupting a formal meeting. You have no authority. Actually, I do. Miss Brighton is entitled to a fair and impartial hearing. Your presence creates a conflict of interest. Either recuse yourself from this entire proceeding, or I'll file a motion with the State Labor Board within the hour. Patricia whispered something to Westbrook. He nodded reluctantly. Vincent, perhaps it would be best if you stepped out. Vincent looked like he wanted to flip the table. Instead, he grabbed his briefcase and stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the framed diplomas on the wall. Westbrook exhaled slowly. Miss Brighton, what would it take to resolve this? Elena thought about Kane lying in a hospital bed upstairs, about her father who deserved better, about every person who'd been dismissed or diminished because they weren't convenient enough, profitable enough, easy enough. Full reinstatement with back pay, public apology from the hospital acknowledging that my suspension was unjustified, a formal investigation into the complaint process to ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else. She paused. And you establish a veteran care ombudsman position to handle complaints and ensure veterans are treated with dignity. Fund it properly. Staff it with someone who actually cares. Westbrook blinked. That's quite a list. Those are my terms. And if we refuse, Ross spoke before Elena could, then we file suit for wrongful termination, retaliation, and violation of federal veteran care grant terms. We request a full audit of your grant compliance, and we make sure every veteran organization in the country knows that Riverside General punishes staff for treating veterans with respect. He leaned back in his chair. Your choice. The room went silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Patricia Warner looked at Westbrook. Westbrook looked at the other board members. Margaret Holland looked at Elena with something that might have been respect. Give us 15 minutes, Westbrook said finally. Elena and Ross stepped out into the hallway. Her hands were shaking, adrenaline flooding her system. You did good, Ross said. I think I'm going to throw up. Also normal. He checked his phone. By the way, you should know there are about 50 veterans outside the hospital right now. They're planning a demonstration of support. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan organized it. Elena's eyes went wide. What? He called me this morning. Said if the hospital doesn't do right by you, his entire SEAL team is going to make this their personal mission. And he's got friends in the media. Ross's expression was unreadable. You've got an army at your back, Elena. Literally. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. 12 minutes later, they were called back inside. Westbrook looked older, more tired. We accept your terms. Full reinstatement, back pay, public apology. The investigation into complaint procedures will begin immediately, and will establish the veteran ombudsman position within 90 days. Elena felt her knees go weak. All of it. All of it. Westbrook's voice was flat. The formal announcement will be made this afternoon. We'll expect you at the press conference. One more thing, Patricia Warner said. Robert Delacroix has withdrawn his complaint and issued a public apology. His diner is facing legal action from multiple veteran advocacy groups. Vincent Delacroix has resigned from the board effective immediately. Elena sat down slowly, the weight of it hitting her all at once. She'd won. Not just the reinstatement, not just the apology. She'd changed the system. Ross stood. We'll see you at the press conference, Director Westbrook. 3 p.m.? 3 p.m., Westbrook confirmed. Elena walked out of the boardroom in a daze. Ross guided her to the elevator, pressed the button for the ground floor. How do you feel? He asked. Like I just survived something I didn't know I could survive. That's because you did. The elevator doors opened. Welcome to the other side. Elena stepped out into the lobby and froze. Through the glass doors, she could see them. Over 70 veterans in perfect formation on the hospital grounds. At the front stood Lieutenant Commander Sullivan, flanked by his SEAL team. And in the center, supported by crutches, but standing tall, was Kane Morrison. They weren't protesting. They were waiting for her. Elena pushed through the glass doors, and the wall of sound hit her like a physical force. Not shouting, not chaos, but silence. 73 veterans stood at attention in perfect formation across the hospital's front plaza. Morning sun glinted off medals, off prosthetics, off the kind of discipline that didn't fade even after the uniform came off. Some were young, barely out of their 20s. Others had gray hair and backs bent by decades of service. Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, different branches, different wars, united by a single purpose. Sullivan stood front and center, his posture parade ground perfect. Beside him, Kane balanced on his crutches, his burns freshly bandaged, his face pale but determined. He shouldn't have been out of bed. His chart said, bed rest for another 12 hours minimum. But here he was. Elena stopped 3 feet from the formation, her throat tight. Sullivan spoke first, his voice carrying across the plaza without needing to shout. Nurse Elena Brighton, on behalf of Naval Special Warfare Command and every veteran standing here, we want you to know something. He took 1 step forward. You saw us when others looked away. You made space when others closed doors. You stood your ground when others tried to make you kneel. His eyes were steel and honor. That doesn't go unnoticed. That doesn't go unanswered. Kane shifted his weight, grimacing but steady. You saved my life twice, Elena. Once with kindness, once with your skills. I don't have the words to repay that. You don't owe me anything, Elena said, her voice breaking. Let me finish. Kane's voice was quiet but absolute. You reminded me that there are still people who see us as human. Not damaged goods, not charity cases, not political statements, just people who deserve a seat at the table. Elena's vision blurred. She blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. Not here. Not in front of cameras she could now see positioned on the periphery, reporters filming everything. Sullivan continued. We understand you've been reinstated. We understand the hospital has agreed to changes. That's a victory. But victories don't happen in isolation. He gestured to the formation behind him. Every person here volunteered to stand with you today, to show this hospital, this city, and anyone watching that when someone stands up for veterans, we stand up for them. A woman in her 50s stepped forward from the 3rd row, her left arm ending at the elbow. Former Army medic Elena guessed from the way she carried herself. My name is Sarah Vance. I lost my arm in Baghdad, saving 3 soldiers from a burning Humvee. I came home to a country that thanked me for my service and then wouldn't hire me because I couldn't type fast enough. Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact. You're the first person I've seen in years actually fight back when the system tried to crush decency. That matters more than you know. One by one, others spoke. A Marine who'd lost both legs and been denied entry to a restaurant because his wheelchair blocked the aisle. An Air Force pilot with PTSD who'd been fired from 3 jobs because employers deemed him unstable. A Navy corpsman who'd saved 19 lives in Kandahar and couldn't get a call back for a nursing position because her experience didn't translate to civilian medicine. Each story was a knife wound. Each testimony a reminder of how badly the system failed the people who'd sacrificed everything for it. Elena listened, her hands clasped in front of her to keep them from shaking. These weren't sob stories. These were battle reports, tactical assessments of a culture that praised service in the abstract and abandoned it in practice. When the last veteran finished speaking, Sullivan raised his hand. The formation snapped to attention with a synchronization that made the plaza feel like hallowed ground. Nurse Brighton, we don't ask anything from you. You've already done more than most. His voice drop became personal. But if you're willing, we'd like to make sure what happened here becomes policy everywhere. Not just Riverside General. Every hospital, every business, every place that accepts federal funding for veteran care. Elena found her voice. How? We've got lawyers. We've got advocacy groups. We've got congressional contacts who owe us favors. Sullivan's smile was sharp. And we've got a story that's already trending nationally. We use it. We push legislation. We create accountability. You want me to be the face of a campaign. We want you to be the example. The proof that standing up works. Sullivan tilted his head slightly. But only if you're willing. We won't force you into a fight you didn't choose. Elena looked at Kane, who watched her with quiet understanding. She thought about her father who'd come home broken and been failed by every system meant to help him. About the young medic in the 3rd row who'd lost her arm saving others and couldn't find work. About every person who'd been dismissed because their sacrifice wasn't convenient enough. What do you need from me, she asked. Sullivan's expression shifted, satisfaction mixed with something deeper. Respect. Show up. Tell your story. Let us amplify it. The rest we handle. When? Press conferences at 3. After that, we've got congressional staffers reaching out for testimony. Advocacy groups want interviews. Media requests from 6 different states. Sullivan checked his watch. You've got 5 hours to decide how far you want to take this. Elena's mind raced. 5 hours ago, she'd been suspended, facing termination and a destroyed career. Now she was being offered a platform that could reach millions. The whiplash was dizzying. "I need to check on my patients first," she said. "Of course." Sullivan stepped aside, the formation parting, to create a path back to the hospital entrance. "We'll be here when you're ready." Elena walked through the corridor of veterans, each one nodding or saluting as she passed. Kane caught her eye as she reached the door. "You okay?" he asked. "Ask me in 5 hours." She went back inside, rode the elevator to the 4th floor, and found Rachel Kim waiting by the nurse's station. Her friend's eyes were red-rimmed, her expression caught between relief and something else. "They were going to fire you," Rachel said. "I thought they were going to fire you." "They tried." Elena hugged her hard. "It didn't work," Rachel pulled away, studying her face. "You look different." "I feel different." "Good different or about to collapse different?" "Both." Elena glanced at the board. "Who's covering my patients?" "Waverly's been doing rounds himself. Hasn't complained once. I think he's scared the SEALs are going to audit his clinical decisions." Rachel's smile was wicked. "Also, Margaret wants to see you. She's in her office." Elena found Margaret Holland sitting at her desk, staring at her computer screen like it held answers to questions she hadn't figured out how to ask yet. The supervisor looked up when Elena knocked. "Come in. Close the door." Elena obeyed, sat down without being invited. Margaret removed her reading glasses, rubbed the bridge of her nose. "I owe you an apology." "Yes, you do." "I should have fought harder when Vincent pushed for your suspension. I should have told Westbrook that the complaint was bogus. I should have—" Margaret's voice cracked slightly. "I should have remembered what it was like to be a nurse who gave a damn about doing the right thing instead of a supervisor who cared more about keeping the peace." Elena stayed silent. "My sister's husband is a Marine," Margaret continued. "2 tours in Iraq, came home with a traumatic brain injury, couldn't hold down a job because his memory was unreliable. He tried to get help through the VA, got lost in bureaucracy for 8 months. She met Elena's eyes. He killed himself 3 years ago. My sister found him in their garage." The air left the room. "I'm sorry," Elena said quietly. "I tell myself I did everything I could, that I supported my sister, that I understood, that I was there." Margaret's hands trembled. "But when you stood up for Kane Morrison, when you fought back against the system that tried to punish you for basic decency, I realized I've been complicit. I've been part of the problem." "Margaret, let me finish." Margaret's voice steadied. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for permission to do better, to help you with whatever comes next, to make sure this hospital actually lives up to the promises Westbrook just made in that boardroom." Elena studied her supervisor. The exhaustion, the regret, the genuine determination underneath. "What are you proposing?" "I want to head the Veteran Care Initiative. I want to build the Ombudsman program you demanded. I want to make sure no veteran ever gets treated the way Kane was treated. No staff member ever gets punished for doing the right thing." Margaret leaned forward. "And I want you to help me. You have credibility now. You have attention. We use it to create real change, not just PR talking points." "You're serious?" "Completely." Margaret had failed her when it mattered most, but she was also offering something rare. Acknowledgement and a concrete plan to make amends. "I'll think about it," Elena said. "After the press conference." "Fair enough." Margaret pulled out a folder. "In the meantime, you should know that Vincent Delacroix didn't resign quietly. He's threatening legal action against the hospital for forcing him out. His lawyers are claiming retaliation, defamation, breach of his board contract. Can he win? Probably not, but he can make noise. And noise means more media coverage, more scrutiny, more opportunities for things to get messy." Margaret slid the folder across the desk. "These are emails he sent to other board members over the past 6 months. Complaints about problematic staff, suggestions to tighten disciplinary procedures, proposals to reduce funding for veterans programs to balance the budget." Elena flipped through the pages, her stomach sinking. Vincent hadn't just been protecting his brother. He'd been systematically working to undermine anyone and anything that didn't serve his vision of profitable, conflict-free hospital management. "This is evidence of a pattern." "Exactly. Nathaniel Ross already has copies. So does the State Labor Board investigator." Margaret's smile was grim. "Vincent picked the wrong fight." Elena closed the folder. "Thank you for this. Thank me by making sure this actually changes things." Margaret put her glasses back on. "Now go. You've got a press conference to prepare for." At 2:30, Elena walked into the hospital's main conference room. It had been transformed into a media staging area. Microphones, cameras, lights, hot enough to make her skin prickle. Director Westbrook stood near the podium, looking 10 years older than he had that morning. Caroline Fletcher hovered nearby with talking points on a tablet. Nathaniel Ross waited in the back row, arms crossed, watching everything with professional skepticism. And along the side wall, standing at parade rest, were Sullivan and his team. Kane was there too, leaning heavily on his crutches, but refusing to sit. Westbrook approached Elena, his voice low. "We're going to make a brief statement acknowledging the complaint was unfounded, announcing your reinstatement, and outlining our new veteran care initiatives. Then you say a few words. Keep it gracious, keep it brief, and we move on." "No," Elena said. Westbrook blinked. "Excuse me. I'm not keeping it brief. I'm not keeping it gracious. I'm telling the truth about what happened and why it matters." Elena's voice was level. "You can join me on that podium and own it, or you can step aside and I'll do it myself. But we're not spinning this into a feel-good PR moment." Westbrook's jaw tightened. Caroline looked horrified. Sullivan from across the room nodded once. "Miss Brighton, it's Nurse Brighton, and those are my terms. You agreed to transparency?" "This is what transparency looks like." Westbrook glanced at Caroline, who shook her head frantically. Then he looked at the cameras, at the reporters filling the front rows, at the veterans lining the wall like sentinels. "Fine," he said tightly, "but if this blows up in our faces—" "It won't." Elena moved toward the podium. "Not unless you've got more skeletons in your closet." Westbrook went pale. At exactly 3 o'clock, the press conference began. Westbrook made his opening statement, wooden, carefully worded, hitting every approved talking point. The complaint was unfounded. Nurse Brighton had acted with professionalism and compassion. Riverside General was committed to serving veterans with dignity. Then he stepped aside and Elena took the podium. The room went silent. She gripped the edges of the wooden lectern, felt the heat of the lights, saw the red recording indicators on a dozen cameras. Somewhere in the back, a reporter's phone buzzed. Elena took a breath. "My name is Elena Brighton. I've been an ICU nurse at Riverside General for 6 years. 2 days ago, I bought breakfast for a Navy SEAL named Kane Morrison because every other person in the diner refused to let him sit down." She paused. "And for that act of basic human decency, I was suspended." The room erupted. Reporters shouting questions, cameras clicking, voices overlapping in chaos. Westbrook looked like he wanted to crawl under the podium. Elena raised her hand and the noise died down. "I want to tell you why I did it. Not because I'm a hero, not because I wanted attention, but because my father was a Marine." She told them about Staff Sergeant Daniel Brighton, about his service in the Gulf War, about the Purple Heart earned pulling wounded men from a burning vehicle, about the PTSD that went untreated because the VA was overwhelmed and underfunded, about the way he withdrew from the world, from his family, from himself. He died 6 years ago in a motel room, alone, forgotten by the country he'd served. Elena's voice cracked, but she pushed through. "When I saw Kane Morrison standing in that diner, turned away by table after table, I saw my father. I saw every veteran who gets thanked for their service and then treated like an inconvenience. And I decided I wouldn't be part of that system anymore." A reporter in the front row had tears on her cheeks. Westbrook stared at the floor. Sullivan stood motionless, his jaw tight. "This isn't about me. It's about a culture that praises sacrifice in speeches and ignores it in practice. It's about hospitals and businesses and institutions that take veteran care funding and then punish staff who actually try to provide that care." Elena's hands were steady now, her voice clear. "Riverside General tried to silence me because it was easier than confronting their own failures. They failed." She looked directly at the camera from the largest network station. "To every veteran watching this, you deserve better. To every healthcare worker who's been told to stay quiet about injustice, speak up anyway. To every person who's ever wondered if standing up matters." She paused. "It does. It always does." Elena stepped back from the podium. The room exploded with questions. "What happens next? Are you suing the hospital? What do you say to Vincent Delacroix?" Elena ignored them all. She walked past Westbrook, past Caroline's horror-struck expression, past Ross's approving nod. She walked straight to Kane. "How'd I do?" she asked quietly. "You just changed the conversation." Kane's smile was genuine. "Well done." Sullivan moved in his voice low enough that only Elena and Kane could hear. "We've got congressional staffers waiting to talk to you. 3 veteran advocacy organizations want you for their campaigns. And the VA Secretary's office just reached out." Elena's head spun. The VA Secretary. Apparently she's a Navy veteran herself. She wants to use your story to push for funding increases and reform legislation. Sullivan's expression was unreadable. You just became the most valuable asset the veteran community has had in years. I don't want to be an asset. I want to be a nurse. Then be both. Sullivan gestured to the chaos behind them. You've got leverage now. Use it to make sure other nurses don't get punished for doing their jobs. Use it to make sure other veterans don't get turned away from diners and businesses. Use it to matter. Elena looked back at the press conference. Westbrook was trying to regain control, stammering through non-answers. Reporters were already typing on their phones, filing stories that would go live within minutes. Outside the windows, she could see more veterans gathering. Word had spread, bringing people from across the state to stand in solidarity. This is going to get bigger, isn't it? She said. Much bigger. Kane adjusted his crutches. Question is, are you ready for it? Elena thought about her father, about the way he'd taught her to stand her ground even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. Yeah, she said, I'm ready. The next 3 hours were a blur. Interviews with sympathetic reporters, conference calls with advocacy groups, a private meeting with 2 congressional aides who promised to introduce legislation requiring transparency in veteran care complaints. Ross handled the legal angles. Sullivan coordinated media strategy. Margaret Holland took notes and made plans for the hospital's new ombudsman program. By 7 o'clock, Elena was exhausted down to her bones. She was in a private office drinking terrible coffee and reviewing talking points for a morning show interview when Rachel burst in. Elena, you need to see this. Rachel turned on the TV. The local news was covering a developing story. The Anchor Diner was burning. Flames poured from the windows, black smoke billowing into the evening sky. Fire crews battled the blaze while police held back crowds. The news anchor's voice was tense. Authorities are investigating whether this fire is connected to ongoing protests against the Anchor Diner following allegations of discrimination against a disabled Navy SEAL. The fire department reports that accelerants were found at the scene suggesting possible arson. Elena's coffee cup slipped from her hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Oh no, she whispered. Rachel grabbed her arm. Elena, people are going to blame you. They're going to say the protests went too far, that you incited violence. I didn't. But Elena's mind was already racing through the implications. The veterans who'd stood outside the diner with signs, the angry phone calls Robert had mentioned, the brick through his window. Someone had taken it too far, and she was about to become responsible for it, whether she'd intended it or not. The office door opened. Sullivan stood there, his expression grim. We've got a problem, he said. I saw. It's worse than you think. Sullivan pulled up something on his phone, showed her. It was a social media post from an anonymous account. Justice for veterans. Burn the bigots out. Attached was a photo of Robert Delacroix's diner with a target painted over it. When was this posted? Elena asked, her voice hollow. 3 hours ago, before the fire started. Sullivan's jaw was tight. Police are going to want to talk to you. Media is going to ask if you condone this. Vincent Delacroix is already calling it terrorism. Elena sank into a chair. In 48 hours, she'd gone from suspended nurse to national symbol to potential scapegoat for arson. I never wanted this, she said. I know. Sullivan crouched beside her chair. But wanting doesn't matter now. What matters is how you respond. How do I respond to something I didn't do, something I never asked for? By being clear about where you stand, by condemning violence while maintaining your position on the discrimination issue, by refusing to let this derail the actual conversation. Sullivan's voice was firm. You didn't set that fire, Elena. Some angry idiot did. Don't let them turn you into the villain. But Elena knew how these things worked. She'd watched enough news cycles to understand that nuance died in sound bites, that complex situations got reduced to tribal battles, that the story would become Nurses Crusade leads to arson instead of veteran discrimination exposed. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Hello, Elena Brighton. The voice was male-controlled professional. This is Detective Marcus Wright with Denver Police. I need you to come down to the station for a statement regarding the fire at the Anchor Diner. Elena's heart hammered. Am I being charged with something? Not at this time, but we're investigating possible connections between the protests you've been associated with and tonight's arson. Your cooperation would be appreciated. I'll be there within the hour. She hung up. Sullivan was already on his phone calling Ross. Rachel paced the small office, her face pale. Elena, this is bad. Really bad. Elena smoothed her blazer and forced herself to think clearly. She hadn't set the fire. She hadn't called for violence. She'd called for accountability and dignity, but someone had twisted her message into justification for destruction, and now she had to face the consequences of a movement she'd never meant to start. The police station was a squat brick building downtown, its parking lot flooded with media vans and protesters on both sides. Veterans supporting Elena, local business owners condemning the arson. Elena walked through the gauntlet with Sullivan and Ross flanking her cameras, tracking every step. Inside, Detective Wright was a barrel-chested man in his 50s with graying temples and eyes that had seen too much. He led them to an interview room, gestured for Elena to sit. "For the record, you're here voluntarily," Wright said. "You're not under arrest. You can leave at any time." "Noted," Ross said, sitting beside Elena. Wright opened a file. "Tell me about your relationship with Robert Delacroix." "I don't have one. I met him once at his diner 2 days ago." "And what happened during that meeting?" Elena recounted the story. Kane being turned away, her sharing her table, Robert's comment in the parking lot. She kept her voice steady, clinical, like she was reporting a patient's symptoms. Wright took notes. "And after that, he filed a complaint with my hospital. I was suspended. Then the story went public. I had nothing to do with what happened to his diner." "Did you encourage protests?" "No. Veterans organized themselves. I wasn't involved. But you benefited from the publicity." Ross cut in. "Detective, is my client being accused of something specific? Or are we fishing?" Wright leaned back. "Someone set fire to Robert Delacroix's business. That same business was the center of protests stemming from Miss Brighton's allegations. I'm trying to establish whether there's a connection." "The connection," Elena said quietly, "is that Robert Delacroix discriminated against a disabled veteran and then tried to retaliate against the person who called him out. What happened tonight is awful. It's criminal, and I condemn it completely. But it's not my fault. Tell that to Robert Delacroix. He's in the hospital being treated for smoke inhalation. He went back inside to try to save his restaurant." Elena's stomach turned. "Is he okay?" "He'll survive, but his business is gone. 30 years of work destroyed." Wright's expression was hard. "You say you wanted accountability. Well, this is what accountability looks like to some people." "That's not accountability," Elena said, her voice rising. "That's vigilante violence. That's the exact opposite of what I stand for." "Then you need to say that publicly, before someone else gets hurt." "Am I free to go?" Wright nodded. "For now, but we'll be in touch." She walked out of the police station into a wall of camera flashes and shouted questions. Elena stopped on the steps, Sullivan and Ross behind her. "I'll make a statement," she said. Ross's hand landed on her shoulder. "Are you sure?" "Yes." The reporters surged forward. Elena held up her hand, waited for silence. "I want to be absolutely clear about something. What happened to the Anchor Diner tonight was wrong. It was criminal, and I condemn it without reservation." Her voice carried across the parking lot. "I stood up for Chief Kane Morrison because he deserved to be treated with dignity. I fought back against my suspension because the system was unjust. But I never ever called for violence." A reporter shouted, "Do you take responsibility for the protesters' actions?" "I take responsibility for my own actions. I can't control what other people do in my name." Elena's hands clenched. "But to anyone who thinks arson or intimidation or violence serves the veteran community, you're wrong. You're hurting the cause, and you need to stop." "What about Robert Delacroix? I hope he recovers. I hope he learns something from this experience. But I will not apologize for calling out discrimination just because someone else took things too far." She turned and walked to Sullivan's truck, ignoring the shouted follow-up questions. Inside the vehicle, the silence was heavy. "That was good," Ross finally said. "Direct, condemning the violence without backing down from your position. The media will eat it up." "I don't care what the media thinks," Elena said. "Someone almost died tonight." "Yeah." Sullivan pulled out of the parking lot. "And tomorrow we figure out who's responsible." They drove back to the hospital where Kane was waiting in his room, watching news coverage on his tablet. He looked up when Elena entered. "You okay?" he asked. "No." Elena collapsed into the visitor's chair. "This is spiraling. I just wanted to do the right thing, and now there's arson and police investigations, and people are getting hurt. That's not on you, isn't it? If I hadn't made a scene, if I just paid for breakfast and walked away, then Robert Delacroix would still be discriminating against veterans. Your hospital would still be retaliating against staff who speak up, and nothing would change." Kane set his tablet aside. "You lit a match, Elena. Other people poured gasoline. That's not the same thing." Elena put her head in her hands. "I don't know how to do this. How to be the person everyone thinks I am. You don't have to be. You just have to be yourself. The same person who shared her table and stood her ground. Kane's voice was gentle. And if that's not enough, he paused, then we figure it out together. Elena looked up, saw the exhaustion on his face, the pain he was pushing through, the determination underneath it all. You should be resting, she said. So should you. Touché. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. She almost didn't open it. You think you're a hero? You're just a troublemaker who destroyed an innocent man's livelihood. Watch your back. Elena stared at the message, her blood going cold. Then another text came through, and another. All threatening, all anonymous, all filled with the kind of rage that didn't care about truth or nuance or justice. Kane saw her expression. What is it? Elena showed him the phone. His face went hard. Sullivan needs to see this, now. Within 20 minutes, Sullivan had coordinated with hospital security to establish a protective detail. 2 of his team members would rotate shifts outside Elena's apartment. The police were notified about the threats. Ross started paperwork for a restraining order against unknown parties. But the damage was done. Elena Brighton, the nurse who'd stood up for a veteran, was now a target. And somewhere in Denver, someone was watching, waiting, planning their next move. 3 hours later, Sullivan knocked on Kane's door. Dawn was just starting to break. We've got a lead on the arson, he said quietly. Elena sat up from where she dozed in the chair, her neck stiff. What kind of lead? She asked. Sullivan showed her a grainy photo on his phone. A man in dark clothing, face partially obscured, carrying a red gas container. Security footage from across the street caught this guy approaching the diner at 6:47 last night. Police enhanced the image and got a preliminary ID. Marcus Webb, former employee Robert, fired 3 months ago. Has a record assault vandalism. Did 6 months for setting his ex-girlfriend's car on fire. Elena's stomach dropped. So this wasn't about the protests at all. Probably not. Webb had his own grudge. The protests just gave him cover. Sullivan pocketed his phone. Detective Wright is bringing him in now. If he's the one, this clears you completely. Relief flooded through her, so intense it made her dizzy. When will they know for sure? Few hours, maybe less, if Webb cracks under questioning. Sullivan glanced at Kane. In the meantime, you've got another problem. Just one. Elena's voice was dry. Vincent Delacroix held a press conference at 6 this morning. Claimed you incited violence against his family's business. Demanded you be fired, arrested, and prosecuted. The relief evaporated. Sullivan pulled up a video. Vincent stood behind a podium flanked by lawyers, his face red with fury. Elena Brighton's reckless accusations created an environment where violence became acceptable. My brother almost died trying to save his life's work. This is the direct result of her campaign of harassment. The video ended. Elena stared at the screen, rage rising in her throat. He's blaming me publicly while the police have a suspect. He doesn't care about facts. He cares about controlling the narrative. Sullivan's voice was hard. Vincent's trying to make you the villain, so his forced resignation looks justified. If he can convince people you're dangerous, unstable, a radical who incites violence, he becomes the victim instead of the corrupt board member who tried to silence you. Kane spoke from the bed. He's also trying to scare you into backing down. If you retreat, apologize, disappear, his story wins. I'm not backing down. Good. Sullivan's expression shifted. Because Ross is organizing a counter press conference in 2 hours. We respond now before Vincent's narrative takes root. By 8 o'clock, Nathaniel Ross had assembled a response team outside the hospital. Elena stood at the podium, flanked by Sullivan and Kane in his wheelchair. Behind them, veterans lined up in silent support. Her hands gripped the lectern knuckles, white. Vincent Delacroix is a liar, she said, her voice cutting through the morning air. Reporters surged forward, cameras clicking. He's lying about my role in the arson. He's lying about his reasons for resigning, and he's lying about his commitment to veterans. As she paused, let the words settle. Police have identified a suspect in the Anchor Diner fire, a former employee with a personal grudge and a criminal history of arson. This had nothing to do with the protests, nothing to do with veteran advocacy, and nothing to do with me. A reporter shouted, "How did you obtain information about the police investigation?" The investigation is ongoing, and I'm cooperating fully. But Vincent Delacroix knows this. He knows there's a suspect. Yet he's desperate to make himself the victim because the truth is too damaging. She pulled out a folder, held it up. These are internal hospital emails showing Vincent Delacroix systematically worked to reduce veteran care funding, tighten disciplinary procedures against staff who advocated for patients, and protect his brother's discriminatory business practices. He didn't resign because of public pressure. He resigned because he was about to be exposed. Ross stepped to the microphone. My client has condemned the arson unequivocally. She will not be intimidated by Vincent Delacroix's baseless accusations. Furthermore, we are filing a defamation lawsuit against Mr. Delacroix for his false and malicious statements. The press conference dissolved into chaos. Elena walked back inside with Sullivan and Kane, her heart pounding. That was a declaration of war, Kane said quietly. Good, Elena said. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. I'm done playing defense. By noon, the story had shifted. News outlets reported Marcus Webb's arrest. Gas receipts, a burner phone with texts about making Robert pay traces of accelerant on his clothes. He was already admitting to setting the fire. Vincent's narrative collapsed in real time. Social media turned on him, dragging up his history of controversial decisions. Former hospital staff came forward describing his pattern of retaliation. By 2 in the afternoon, Vincent's lawyers released a statement claiming he'd been misinformed. No apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just corporate doublespeak. Elena was in the cafeteria when Margaret Holland found her. The board met this morning, Margaret said. Emergency session. They voted unanimously to accept Vincent's resignation effective immediately. They also approved full funding for the Veteran Care Ombudsman program. Elena set down her sandwich. All of it. All of it. Margaret's expression was cautious. Westbrook wants you to know the hospital stands behind you completely. Westbrook wants to cover his ass completely. Elena's voice was flat. 2 days ago, he was ready to throw me under the bus. You're not wrong. Margaret's voice dropped. But the Ombudsman program is real. The funding is real. We've got an opportunity to change things. Don't waste it being angry at people who were wrong. Elena studied her supervisor. The exhaustion was still there, but so was determination. Tell Westbrook I'll work with the program, Elena said. But I'm not doing joint appearances. I'm not playing nice for cameras. Fair enough. Margaret stood. For what it's worth, you've changed more in 3 days than I changed in 6 years. That matters. Elena's phone buzzed. A text from Rachel. Turn on Channel 7, now. Elena pulled up the live stream. The news anchor's face was grim. Breaking news in the Denver veteran discrimination case. Robert Delacroix has filed a lawsuit against his brother Vincent, claiming Vincent pressured him to file the false complaint against nurse Elena Brighton. Elena's breath caught. The anchor continued. According to court documents, Robert alleges his brother threatened to withdraw financial support for the diner unless Robert cooperated with a scheme to discredit Nurse Brighton. The screen cut to footage of Robert leaving a lawyer's office, his face haggard. A reporter thrust a microphone at him. Mr. Delacroix, why are you coming forward now? Robert stopped, his voice rough from smoke damage. Because I almost died in that fire. Sitting in that hospital bed, I had time to think. About the veteran I turned away. About the nurse I tried to destroy because my brother told me to. He paused, throat working. I was wrong. Vincent used me, and I let him because I was scared and desperate and stupid. Do you stand by your original complaint? No, it was a lie, all of it. Robert looked at her camera. Elena Brighton did nothing wrong. Chief Morrison deserved better, and I'm sorry. Elena stared at her phone, the words not quite processing. Robert had turned on his own brother. Kane appeared in the cafeteria doorway, navigating on his crutches. He lowered himself into a chair. You saw, he said. Yeah. Vincent's done. They sat in silence, the weight of it settling over them. Elena's phone rang. Ross's name on the screen. Did you see Robert's lawsuit? Ross asked. Just now. This changes everything. Robert's willing to testify that Vincent coerced him. That's conspiracy, fraud, abuse of power. The DA is opening a criminal investigation. Vincent Delacroix is going to face charges. What about Robert? If he testifies against Vincent, the DA might offer immunity. He's already lost his business and almost his life. My guess is he'll take whatever deal keeps him out of prison. Elena closed her eyes. This is really happening. It's really happening. You won, Elena, completely. But it didn't feel like winning. It felt like watching a house collapse. What happens next, she asked. We wait for Vincent's arrest. We prepare for trial if it goes that far. And we make sure the reforms stick. Ross's tone shifted. You should also know that 3 other hospitals in Colorado have reached out. They want to implement similar veteran care programs. Elena hung up and sat in silence. Kane watched her carefully. You okay? He asked. I don't know what okay is anymore. That's normal. Kane reached across the table. You did something most people never have the courage to do. You stood up when it had consequences. You didn't back down when the system tried to crush you. And you won. Elena looked at him. This man who'd lost his leg in service, who'd been turned away from a diner, who'd become an unlikely ally. Thank you, she said quietly, for calling Sullivan, for standing with me, for not letting me quit. You wouldn't have quit. You're not built that way. Kane's smile was soft. But you're welcome anyway. The rest of the day unfolded in surreal slow motion. Vincent Delacroix was arrested at 4 in the afternoon, charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and filing false official documents. The mugshot was everywhere within an hour. Hospital administration released a statement reiterating their support for Elena. Westbrook gave an interview expressing deep regret for the suspension and pride in Elena's courage. Elena ignored it all. She returned to Kane's room, helped him with medications, checked his burns, and pretended everything hadn't fundamentally changed. At 7, Sullivan knocked on the door. "We need to talk," he said. Elena followed him to a private consultation room. Sullivan closed the door. "The Navy wants to present you and Kane with commendations," he said. "Official recognition. There will be a ceremony, press coverage, the whole 9 yards. Elena shook her head. "I don't want a ceremony. It's not about what you want. It's about visibility. If the Navy publicly honors you, it sends a message to every hospital, every business, every institution that takes federal veteran funding. Treat veterans and their advocates with respect or face consequences." Sullivan crossed his arms. "This is bigger than you now. It's policy. It's precedent. I'm not a symbol. I'm a nurse who bought someone breakfast. You were a nurse who bought someone breakfast. Now you're the person who proved that one act of decency can change a system." Sullivan's voice softened. "I know you didn't sign up for this, but you're here, and you can either let other people define what it means, or you can help shape it." Elena thought about the veterans who'd stood outside the hospital, about the advocacy groups calling for legislation, about the hospitals reaching out. "What would the ceremony involve?" she asked. 4 hours, naval station, formal uniform for Kane, business attire for you. Secretary of the Navy presents commendations, speeches, photos. Sullivan showed her a schedule. "You don't have to give a speech if you don't want to. Just show up, accept the commendation, let the moment happen. When? 1 week. Gives Kane time to heal. Gives us time to coordinate with congressional allies." Elena studied the schedule. If she said no, the story ended here. Local news, small reforms, limited impact. If she said yes, it became national, legislative, permanent. "I'll do it," she said, "on one condition. Name it. Every veteran who stood outside this hospital gets invited. They don't stand in the background. They stand with us." Sullivan's smile was sharp. "Done." The next 5 days blurred together. Elena returned to work greeted with a mixture of hero worship and carefully neutral professionalism. Some staff thanked her. Others avoided eye contact. She didn't care. She had patience to care for work to do. Kane was discharged on day 3, his burns healing well enough for outpatient treatment. He'd be staying in Denver another week for the ceremony, then returning to Virginia. Elena found herself simultaneously relieved and disappointed. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm. Morning coffee before her shift, evening check-ins, texts throughout the day about nothing important. It felt natural in a way relationships rarely did. "You'll keep in touch, right?" she asked the night before the ceremony, sitting on her couch while Kane occupied the armchair. "Try to stop me." Kane's expression was warm. "Besides, Sullivan's already talking about making you an honorary member of the team. You're stuck with us now." "I could think of worse fates." "So could I." The silence that followed was comfortable, weighted with things neither was quite ready to say. The ceremony took place at the Colorado National Guard facility transformed for the occasion. Flags lined the entrance, honor guards stood at attention, media platforms along the perimeter. Elena wore a Navy suit, her hair pulled back. She felt exposed, but Sullivan had been right. This wasn't about her comfort. It was about sending a message. Kane stood beside her in dress uniform medals, gleaming, his prosthetic leg visible. He'd insisted on transparency, making it part of the narrative. Behind them, 73 veterans formed up. Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force. Different ages, different backgrounds, united by service. The Secretary of the Navy was a woman in her 60s, with steel gray hair and commanding presence. She approached the podium with military precision. "We are here to recognize 2 individuals whose actions exemplify the values we hold sacred: courage, integrity, and unwavering commitment to doing what's right." Her voice carried across the crowd. Chief Warrant Officer Kane Morrison and Nurse Elena Brighton reminded this nation that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. That dignity isn't negotiable. That one person standing up can change everything. She called Kane forward first. He moved to the podium, stood at attention as she pinned the commendation to his uniform. For exceptional courage in rescuing 3 civilians from a burning vehicle, risking your life to save others, and for your continued dedication to veteran advocacy, I present you with the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. The crowd erupted. Kane saluted, his back straight. Then Elena's name was called. She walked to the podium on legs that felt disconnected. The secretary smiled at her, something genuine in her eyes. Elena Brighton, for your extraordinary advocacy on behalf of veterans, your courage in standing against institutional injustice, and your unwavering commitment to dignity and respect for those who serve, I present you with the Department of the Navy Distinguished Public Service Award. She pinned the medal to Elena's jacket. Elena stared at it. Heavy, ornate, surreal. Thank you, she managed. No, the secretary said quietly. Thank you. The ceremony concluded with a formation salute. Elena and Kane stood at the center, medals, gleaming cameras flashing the weight of what they'd accomplished, settling over them. Afterward, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes approached. Representative Susan Matthews, she introduced herself. I'm sponsoring legislation based on what happened here. The Veterans Dignity Act, requiring transparency in veteran care complaints, establishing federal protections for staff who advocate for veterans, and mandating ombudsman programs at facilities receiving veteran care funding. Elena's eyes widened. That's significant. It's necessary. What Vincent Delacroix did happens all the time, quietly without consequences. Matthews's expression was fierce. You made it loud. You made it visible. Now we make it illegal. When does it go to vote? 3 months if we gather enough support. I'd like you to testify. Your story carries weight that statistics never will. Elena thought about her father, about Kane, about every veteran who'd stood outside the hospital and shared their stories. I'll be there, she said. The reception lasted 2 hours. Elena shook hands, posed for photos, answered questions. Kane stayed close, a steady presence. Finally, as the crowd thinned, they found themselves alone near the edge of the venue, looking out over Colorado landscape painted gold by the setting sun. You did good today, Kane said. We did good, Elena corrected. Best breakfast of my life. Mine too. Elena's phone buzzed. Detective Wright. Miss Brighton, Marcus Webb has been formally charged with arson and attempted murder. He's pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. The case is closed. And Robert Delacroix. He's testifying against his brother. DA's offering immunity. Vincent Delacroix will face trial in 6 weeks. Wright paused. Robert also asked me to pass along a message. He sold what's left of the diner property and donated the proceeds to a veterans organization. For whatever that's worth. Elena closed her eyes. Thank you for telling me. She hung up. Kane raised an eyebrow. Webb confessed. Robert's cooperating. Vincent's going to trial. It's really over. Yeah, Elena said quietly. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The immediate crisis was resolved, but the work was just beginning. Before she could speak, Sullivan appeared. We've got a situation, he said. Elena's stomach dropped. What kind? Sullivan showed her a news alert. Veteran denied service at Phoenix Hospital. Staff member suspended for speaking out. The headline was almost identical. They're asking for you, Sullivan said. The suspended staff member, the veteran, the advocacy groups. They want to know if you'll help them fight back. Elena looked at Kane. He met her eyes, something unspoken passing between them. What do you think? She asked. Kane's smile was slow and certain. I think we're just getting started. Elena turned back to Sullivan. Tell them yes, she said. 6 weeks later, Elena stood in a courtroom as Vincent Delacroix's verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. 18 months federal prison, 5 years probation, permanent disqualification from holding positions involving oversight of public funds. Elena watched from the gallery, Kane beside her, Sullivan behind them. She felt no triumph, just quiet certainty that justice had arrived. 3 months after that, she stood in Washington, D.C. as the president signed the Veterans Dignity Act into law. Elena wore her Navy medal. Kane stood in dress uniform beside her. Representative Matthews smiled from the front row. The president's words echoed through the chamber. This legislation exists because ordinary people did extraordinary things. They stood up when standing up had consequences. They refused to be silenced when silence was easier. They proved that one person's courage can change a nation. His eyes found Elena. Thank you for reminding us what service really means. Elena slipped away after an hour, needing air. She found it on a balcony overlooking the National Mall. Kane found her 20 minutes later. Hiding, he asked. Breathing. Kane leaned against the railing, their shoulders almost touching. I've been thinking, he said, about what comes next. The alliance is growing, 7 states, 3 full-time staff. I want us. Elena's breath caught. She turned to face him. Us, she managed. I'm in Virginia. You're in Colorado. We've been doing this long-distance thing for 3 months. It works. Kane reached out his hand, finding hers. But I don't want distance anymore. I want to wake up and have coffee with you. I want to plan strategy over dinner. I want to build this thing we started actually together. He paused. I'm transferring to the Navy's regional command in Denver. Sullivan approved it, if you want to. Elena thought about the late-night calls when cases got hard, the way Kane understood without explanation, the quiet moments between chaos. She thought about her father who taught her that standing up mattered. She thought about Kane who'd stood beside her and never wavered. I want to, she said quietly. Very much. Kane's smile was sunrise bright. He pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. Good, he whispered, because I'm not going anywhere. They kissed on that balcony overlooking monuments to service and sacrificed 2 people who'd found each other in crisis and built something that mattered. 1 year to the day after their first breakfast, Elena and Kane returned to the lot where the Anchor Diner had stood. The building was gone, demolished after the fire, but the Veterans Organization had purchased the property and transformed it. A memorial park, benches in careful rows, a flagpole at the center, plaques honoring local veterans. At the heart stood a simple marker, in memory of all veterans who served with honor and deserved to be seen. A small ceremony marked the dedication. The mayor spoke about change. Veterans shared stories. Elena was asked to say a few words. She stepped forward, Kane beside her, and looked at the assembled crowd. Sullivan and his team. Margaret Holland, now Director of Veteran Care Services at Riverside General, Rachel Kim, Nathaniel Ross, the 73 veterans who'd stood in formation. A year ago, I bought breakfast for a stranger, Elena said. That small act became something bigger than I ever imagined. Not because I'm special, but because it mattered. She paused. Every day people make choices about whether to look away or lean in, whether to stay silent or speak up, whether to accept injustice or fight back. She gestured to the memorial park. This exists because enough people chose to lean in, to speak up, to fight back. And it will keep existing as long as we remember that one person's courage can change everything. Her eyes found faces in the crowd. Veterans who'd found dignity, healthcare workers who'd found support, allies who'd found purpose. So, to everyone who's ever been told to be quiet, to back down, to accept that this is just how things are, don't. Stand up, speak out, make space at your table. She smiled. You never know what might happen when you do. The ceremony ended with a flag raising, veterans saluting, civilians with hands over hearts, the fabric catching wind and snapping against the blue Colorado sky. Kane pulled Elena aside. You know what I just realized, he asked. What? That diner owner told you not to encourage that kind of scene. Kane's smile was soft. And you responded by creating the biggest, most important scene of your life. Elena laughed, the sound bright and free. I guess I did. Kane kissed her forehead. Don't stop. Don't plan to. The Veterans Dignity Alliance continued to grow. By year's end, they'd handled 47 cases across 16 states. 39 resulted in policy changes or personnel accountability. 8 were still in progress. 0 had been abandoned. Elena balanced nursing with alliance leadership. Her clinical skills informed her advocacy. Her advocacy made her a better nurse. Kane became the alliance's operations director, bringing military precision to their protocols. Sullivan remained an advisory board member. 2 years after that breakfast, Elena Brighton stood at a Senate podium testifying before the Committee on Veterans Affairs. She wore her Navy medal. Kane sat in the front row. The gallery was packed. The work isn't finished, Elena told the senators. We've made progress, but every day veterans still face discrimination. Healthcare workers still face retaliation. The system still protects the powerful over the vulnerable. She leaned forward. Staff Sergeant Daniel Brighton was my father. He served this country in the Gulf War. He earned a Purple Heart. And he died alone in a motel room because we failed him. Her voice didn't waver. I'm here to make sure we don't fail another veteran, another nurse, another person who has the courage to stand up and say, this isn't right. She looked at each senator. The question isn't whether you support veterans. It's whether you'll give us the tools to actually help them, fund the programs, enforce the laws, hold institutions accountable. Elena stepped back. One seat, one stand, one movement. That's how change begins. But it's how you vote today that determines whether it continues. The hearing room erupted in applause. 6 months later, Congress passed the Veterans Dignity Enhancement Act, expanding funding and oversight. Elena's testimony was cited in the committee report as the turning point. Through it all, Elena and Kane built a life together. Not perfect, not easy, but meaningful. They bought a small house halfway between Denver and the Navy Regional Command, adopted a rescue dog named Charlie, hosted monthly alliance dinners, trained new advocates, fought new battles. On quiet Sunday mornings, they'd sit on their porch with coffee and watch the sunrise paint the mountains gold. "You ever think about that first breakfast?" Kane asked one morning. "Every day," Elena said. "Regret any of it." She thought about the chaos and threats, the sleepless nights and constant pressure, the way their lives had been turned inside out by a single act of kindness. "Not for a second," she said. Kane smiled and took her hand. "Me neither." The sun rose higher, burning through the morning mist. Somewhere in America, another veteran was being turned away. Another nurse was facing retaliation. Another injustice was happening in quiet spaces where no one was looking. But now there was a movement, an alliance, a network of people who'd learned that standing up mattered, that silence was complicity, that change was possible if you were willing to fight for it. Elena Brighton had bought breakfast for a stranger and changed the world. Not because she was special, not because she had grand ambitions, but because when faced with a choice between looking away and leaning in, she chose to lean in. And she never stopped. One seat, one stand, one movement at a time.